Old Time Tales presents a film strip flashback.
This is the story of the Robinson family from Switzerland, shipwrecked on the coast of an uninhabited island near New Guinea. As the only survivors of the disaster, the mother, father, and 4 sons made a remarkable home for themselves. Using their intelligence and skill, they were able to create a patch of civilization far from their native home. At the start of the story, the Robinson family was enjoying a trip aboard a ship bound for the New World. How excited the boys had been. Fritz, who was the eldest, helped their father prepare for the journey and often looked after his younger brothers, Ernest, Jack, and little Franz. Suddenly, in the middle of the ocean, a gale blew up that tossed the ship about for 6 long, terrifying days and nights. As a result, it was driven far off course, and no one on board knew where they were. Suddenly, the ship struck a reef and appeared about to break apart. Roaring waters poured in on all sides. The captain cried, "Lower away the boats! We are lost!" At these words, Mr. Robinson looked at the faces of his frightened children and watched his weeping wife kneel in prayer. All about them echoed the screams of the other passengers. In horror, they listened to the terrible sound of wooden planks splitting and of water rushing in. Mr. Robinson ran up on deck, hoping to find help. But in the excitement, the crew and other passengers jumped into lifeboats, leaving the Robinsons on deck. They seemed not to hear the cries and pleas for mercy from the Robinsons. As the last lifeboat left the ship, Mr. Robinson's voice was drowned in the howling of the wind, which still raged about the reef. Now he and his little family were all alone on a ship which seemed doomed to sink at any moment. Being a heroic man and determined to save his wife and children, he tried to find a way of getting them to an island that was visible beyond the reef. And gradually, as if in answer to his desperate prayer, the great storm passed. The next day, the Robinsons remained aboard the tossing ship. The ship did not sink because the stern was jammed between 2 high rocks and was partly raised above the water. Although they seemed safe enough for the time being, they realized that if another storm struck, the ship would certainly go down. It was obvious they had to make plans to abandon the ship soon. So Mr. Robinson and the boys looked over the wrecked vessel while Mrs. Robinson went about making supper for them. Inasmuch as there was plenty of food aboard, the family had a good meal. Certainly, they would need all their strength the next day if they were to reach land. The conversation during that strange supper centered on what they should salvage of the many things on the ship and how they would get it to land. Sometime later, the boys went to sleep. Father and Mother kept guard through the night. Neither of them slept, and at each frightening lurch of the ship, they prayed fervently for the lives of their children. But the fragile vessel held fast. In the morning, the family constructed a vessel out of tubs and loaded it with goods and ammunition. The boys were in high spirits and viewed the whole situation as an interesting adventure. Mrs. Robinson and little Franz took some food to the livestock in the hold of the ship, while the others busied themselves loading their primitive raft with every kind of useful and necessary article, including fish hooks, guns and powder, knives, nails, tools, and many crates and barrels of food. In addition, they took with them geese, pigeons, 10 hens, and 2 roosters which were on the ship. The hens and roosters were placed in one of the large wooden tubs, but the ducks, geese, and pigeons were set free. Swiftly they flew toward the shore. Next, the family climbed into their makeshift raft. At first, Mrs. Robinson was afraid to get into the awkward wooden tub, but realizing she could not remain on the ship, she too took her place. On her lap was a mysterious bag. When they were ready, the 2 oldest boys, Fritz and Ernest, took the oars, while Mr. Robinson stood in the stern to guide the precarious raft to a safe landing place amidst the sharp rocks near the shore. Then they rowed to the island. 2 dogs from the ship swam beside them. Originally, they were going to leave the dogs, Turk and Juno, since they were both very large mastiffs and might upset the raft. But the poor dogs set up such a dismal howl that Mr. Robinson agreed to take them along. As they approached the island, it seemed that there was no safe place for the raft to pull in. But they followed the geese and ducks through the shoals and strong currents, and at last they floated into a small bay where the water was smooth and the land sloped gently upward from low banks. On the island, the Robinsons erected a tent of sailcloth they had taken from the ship. While the younger boys ran to collect moss and grass to spread in the tent for their beds, Mr. Robinson arranged a fireplace with some large flat stones from the nearby brook. Dry twigs and seaweed soon started a warm fire. Mother put her big iron pot over the fire, filled it with water, and put in several little cakes of dry soup. Franz said it looked like glue. Therefore, Fritz and his father shot some game to add to their food supply. Thanks to Fritz, the family would have a fat wild pig for dinner. Meanwhile, Jack, who had been looking for food too, had been bitten by an enormous lobster. His father managed to get him loose, and the lobster, as well as several oysters, were brought back to camp. Everyone was very hungry and eagerly sat about the fire. But then they discovered that they had forgotten to bring any spoons or forks from the ship. Instead, they used a substitute. Shells were used for spoons. The food was dipped out of iron kettles brought from the ship. It took them a while to get used to eating with the oyster shells, and almost everyone scalded his fingers. After the family finished eating, Mrs. Robinson opened the mysterious bag she had so carefully carried from the ship. In it she had put oats, peas, and other grains, which she now fed to the poultry and the pigeons. Grateful to be alive, and apparently without having to worry about food, the Robinson family knelt about their makeshift shelter and offered thanks to God for his mercy. Night fell quite suddenly, without any twilight at all. From this, Mr. Robinson deduced that they must be very close to the equator. It had been an exhausting day, and in a short time, everyone was fast asleep. The next morning, Fritz, the oldest son, and his father explored the island. They hoped to find some trace of other survivors of the shipwreck, but it soon became obvious that they were the only human beings in the area. As they wandered about, they found many important foods in great abundance, including wild coconut trees and large deposits of natural salt. Then, on their way back to the others, they entered a strange-looking thicket. Mr. Robinson recognized the trees around them as calabash trees. Since Fritz did not know what they were, Mr. Robinson explained to his son how natives made utensils from the fruit or gourd of the calabash trees. This was what they needed, so together they hunted until they found some gourds from which dishes and spoons could be made. Then they hurried back to their camp to share their news with the rest of the family. To their delight, the coconuts on the island provided a treat for Mother and the younger boys. There was so much to tell, starting with how Fritz captured a young monkey which soon became a family pet. As the others listened eagerly, Fritz told how the dog, Turk, killed the baby monkey's mother. At first, he and Mr. Robinson feared the tiny creature would die without its mother, but they soon found that he would drink coconut milk by sucking the corner of a handkerchief that had been soaked in it. So they resolved to take the little fellow home with them, and Turk was made to carry him on his back. During the story, the family had been sitting around an improvised dinner table. Suddenly, the camp was attacked by ferocious wild jackals. Fortunately, the two great dogs fought back valiantly and drove off the intruders. But the episode upset Mrs. Robinson so much that she and Mr. Robinson had a long talk afterwards about the future. Mrs. Robinson felt that they would be safer from the elements and wild animals if they left Zoltheim, as they called their camp, and moved inland. Father agreed, but first they would salvage as much from the wrecked ship as possible. In order to make their lives easier and more secure while they remained on the island, Fritz and his father made several trips to the ship in the next few days. First, they took away with them all the remaining food on board, including tubs of butter, rice, flour, biscuits, and several young fruit trees that were ready for planting. On the next trip, they brought back firearms, ammunition, hammocks, lumber, and other useful articles. So thorough were they that they even removed doors and door frames, windows and window frames, chairs, tables, beds, dishes, linen, and clothing. On another trip, they towed to the island some cattle which were on the ship. All in all, they saved a cow, a donkey, 2 goats, 6 sheep, a ram, and a sow. Soon the ship was entirely bare. Just in time, too, for another terrible storm swept the coast, and in a short while the vessel was smashed to bits against the rocks. Even though they were safe from harm, the Robinsons felt very strange watching their last link with their old home disappear into the sea. All this time, the mother and the younger sons were sowing seeds. Still, the next day, they set off to find a more permanent site. While they were away, the cattle, a source of milk and meat, were fenced about in a secluded area. As the family traveled farther and farther inland from the coast, they had many adventures and made many useful discoveries. Nothing, however, was as exciting as the great trees they found a few days later. The trees, which grew to an astonishing height, were mangroves whose arching roots grew above the ground to support the thick main trunk. That night, as they camped high in the roomy branches of the mangrove, all of them agreed that this seemed the perfect place to make a home. Later, a treehouse was constructed as a protection from wild animals. They called their cozy house high above the ground Falconhurst. They worked very hard to move all their possessions from the beach to their new home. Father built a wooden cart and used the cow to pull it. Soon they were snugly settled in. They spent many months at Falconhurst, working and exploring their island still further. They found a flock of wild penguins, an eagle, wild cattle, and many more interesting and useful creatures. Sometime later, the father found a tree which contained long threads. He realized that the long, sword-like blades of fibers were New Zealand flax, which produces a heavy linen fabric. From the fibers, Mother wove cloth for new clothing on a loom that the father had constructed. Everything seemed to be fine for the Robinsons until the rainy winter season began. They soon found that it would be impossible to spend the winter in their treehouse, which was flooded by tropical storms several times a day. At last, they found a perfect dwelling place in a large natural cavern. They called this more spacious home Rockburg, and devoted many months of hard work to making it comfortable and secure. In Rockburg, the rainy season never bothered them, except that they had to spend several weeks indoors. At such times, the family spent the evenings reading books which had been salvaged from the ship. Mother and father were determined that the boys continue their education, even if they should never leave their island home. During the day, however, everyone had chores to do, but the boys still had time to spend many happy hours with their various pets, a tame jackal, an ostrich which they used for riding, and several dogs born to Turk and Juno. They also constructed a canoe and a light Eskimo-type kayak. With everyone contributing, the Robinsons before long had quite a comfortable plantation set out, with a large herd of cattle and every sort of farm produce imaginable. And by improvising, they were able to enjoy many of the things found in established communities. For example, the Robinsons made candles from the sap of native trees so they could have light during night hours. From other trees, they obtained rubber from which they made waterproof boots and rain clothes. Still other trees provided them with sap to make pitch and tar, which they used for their various boats and rafts. Thus 10 years passed, during which time Fritz had become a handsome young man of 25. Whenever possible, he went sailing about the islands surrounding their home in a canoe he himself constructed, for he hoped to find some sign of human life. But each time he returned disappointed, until on one of these trips he found Jenny Montrose, a young girl who had been shipwrecked some time before. For 3 years, this brave girl had lived alone, her only friend and companion, an albatross she had managed to tame. She had cleverly constructed a snug hut for herself, and had trained the albatross to hunt fish and wild birds and rabbits for her. She had long since given up all hope of ever being found. There was so much excitement when Fritz brought her to his parents, who welcomed her into the family. They discovered that Jenny had been born in India, the daughter of a British official. Her mother had died when she was very small, and she had been on her way to join her father in London when her ship had been wrecked. She was overjoyed to find herself once again in the company of civilized people. Everyone adored her, and before long, Jenny was as a daughter to Mr. and Mrs. Robinson. In this manner, several happy months went by, and then, one morning, the sound of cannon shots sent Fritz and his father to investigate. They were afraid that fierce Malay pirates might be attacking their little settlement. But instead of pirates, they found an English ship which had been driven off its course by a storm. When Mr. Robinson boarded the ship and told the amazed captain his story, the captain could scarcely believe the good news, for he had been searching for Jenny Montrose with little hope of ever finding a trace of the girl. Mr. Robinson invited the captain and his passengers to come ashore and have dinner with his family. After looking about, a passenger on the ship, his wife and his daughter, decided to remain on the island. The passenger, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Woolston, was in poor health and felt that the climate of the island would do him good. The Robinsons were very happy to have company in their settlement, which they had decided to call New Switzerland. Of course, the captain was anxious to bring Jenny back to her father in England, for he knew Colonel Montrose personally. Indeed, Colonel Montrose had especially asked him to explore the coast where his daughter's ship had been wrecked 3 years earlier. As for Jenny, she was reluctant to leave the family which she had come to love, but worry and love for her father prompted her to part with the Robinsons. Now that the Woolstons were remaining on the island, there was room on the ship for additional passengers. As a result, the Robinsons had to make many difficult decisions concerning the future of the boys. So that night, mother and father had a long talk with their sons while the ship rode at anchor off the coast. Father Robinson told his sons about Europe and the advantages that it offered. Then, because they were almost adults, he let them decide for themselves. Fritz and Franz, the oldest and the youngest, decided to return to Europe with Jenny, for Franz was very curious about his homeland, which he barely remembered, and hoped to attend a university there, while Fritz told his parents that he loved Jenny and wanted to marry her. Since they already considered the girl as their daughter, they were very happy to hear this news and readily gave their blessing to the couple. So Fritz and Jenny decided to spend some time in England and then return to the island permanently. Jack and Ernest, however, had no desire ever to leave their happy home. Thus, when the ship was ready to leave after a few days, Fritz, Franz, and Jenny boarded the vessel full of dreams and much curiosity. Mr. and Mrs. Robinson waved goodbye to them as they sailed back to their homeland. Fritz had in his possession Mr. Robinson's diary, in which he related everything that happened to the family since the shipwreck. His father wanted the diary to be published because he thought it would both amuse and instruct children. The rest of the Robinson family remained on the island, on which a colony was soon to develop. For in time, Mr. Robinson's hope came true, and countless people responded to the words with which he concluded his diary. To dear old Switzerland, like you, may New Switzerland flourish and prosper, good, happy, and free.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel.